Upon reaching the Slater's wardroom, everyone who takes a guided tour of the ship sees a picture of a young man named Frank Slater. Visitors are told of Slater's courageous actions on board the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, CA-38, in November of 1942. Actions that resulted in his death. They are told of how Slater remained at his post, a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, and fired at an attacking plane right up until it crashed into his station. Everything about the story told to visitors about Frank Slater's death is true, but it's not the whole story. For Frank Slater was not alone. He did not fight alone, nor did he die alone. In fact, there were dozens of other men around his station on the 12th of November 1942, and each of those men showed the same resolve as Slater, and each of them died in the air attack. The San Francisco was a New Orleans-class heavy cruiser. She was laid down on the 9th of September 1931 at the Mare Island Naval Yard in California. She was launched on the 9th of March 1933 and commissioned the 10th of February 1934 with Captain Royal Ingersoll in command. Her shakedown cruise took her to both coasts of the United States, to British Columbia, and to the Hawaiian Islands. After final improvements and modifications, the San Francisco became a part of the Cruiser Division 6, based out of San Diego, California. The ship's first few years in service were spent primarily in training exercises and in showing the flag at various foreign ports in the Eastern Pacific. In January of 1939, the San Francisco became the flagship of Cruiser Division 7. Her first task as flagship was to embark upon a cruise to ports in South America. She left Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in April of 1939 and sailed down the east coast of South America, stopping at numerous ports along the way. Upon reaching the southern tip of South America, the San Francisco transited the Straits of Magellan and then began the return trip west, stopping at more ports along the way. The cruiser completed her trek around South America by passing through the Panama Canal and returning to Cuba. Remarkably, she completed the entire voyage in only 2 months. The San Francisco's South American cruise marked the end of her happy times. 3 months after her voyage, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. San Francisco was ordered to join America's Neutrality Patrol to protect America's interest in the Atlantic. After steaming around the Caribbean for the last few months of 1939, the San Francisco was relieved of her duties by USS Wichita, CA-45, and reassigned to her old squadron in the Pacific. Now part of the Pacific Fleet again, the San Francisco spent much of 1940 in the Puget Sound Navy Yard for overhaul and modernization. She rejoined the Cruiser Squadron 6 in September of 1940 and spent the next year steaming around the eastern Pacific. In late October of 1941, as it became more and more apparent that the United States would become involved in a major conflict, the San Francisco was ordered to a dry dock in Pearl Harbor for another overhaul and more modifications. The repairs were expected to last until late December. The Japanese attack on the 7th of December found the San Francisco in sorry shape. Her engines had been broken down for overhaul, her 8-inch and 5-inch ammunition had been removed for storage, and her 3-inch guns had been removed for quad 1.1-inch guns, which had yet to be installed, and her 50 caliber machine guns were broken down for maintenance as well. All told, the San Francisco met the Japanese attack with 2 30 caliber machine guns and what rifles could be broken out of the small arms lockers. The San Francisco survived the attack on Pearl Harbor without damage and was immediately ordered out to sea. She spent the remainder of 1941 and the first months of 1942 as an escort of the early carrier raids against Rabaul and Japanese installations in the Gilbert and Marshall Island groups. In April of 1942, she returned to Pearl Harbor to serve as an escort for troop transports bound for the Western Pacific and Australia. It was at this time, the 4th of April, that Frank Slater reported aboard. The San Francisco then headed west to support operations against Guadalcanal in the Solomons. After the initial landings on the 7th of August 1942, the San Francisco remained in the Solomons area as part of a covering force of cruisers and destroyers. She then returned briefly to her former role as a carrier escort for the Wasp and Hornet. However, once it became apparent that the Japanese were sending ships to Guadalcanal at night to reinforce and resupply their forces there, she became part of a surface group tasked with patrolling the waters around Guadalcanal each night. Between September and November of 1942, she participated in numerous clashes with the Japanese Navy around Guadalcanal, including the night battle of Cape Esperance on the 11th of October. Beginning in early November, she was assigned to escort convoys of troop and supply ships headed for the island. On the morning of the 12th of November, the San Francisco was covering a landing force at Lunga Point when she received word that an air attack was imminent and that a powerful Japanese air raid was headed towards them. Landing operations were completed quickly, and all ships headed towards more open waters and prepared. About an hour after the initial warning, the convoy came under attack by about 24 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. Lieutenant J.G. John Wallace, assigned to San Francisco's main battery control aft, just forward of Frank Slater's battle station on the after anti-aircraft platform, watched as the bombers dropped their torpedoes in the convoy. As planes began to be shot down, Wallace watched as one plane dropped his torpedo at San Francisco's starboard bow. The ship turned sharply to port, would then put the plane on her starboard quarter. Wallace reported, quote, "About the time I expected that torpedo to hit, it missed. Our anti-aircraft 20mm guns right behind me, right outside my battle station, started to really kick them out. I looked out toward the starboard quarter, and what I saw was a Mitsubishi Betty bomber coming right at me with its starboard engine smoking. I had just enough time to duck inside the outer door when a tremendous explosion knocked me all the way up to the forward side of the secondary con, and I lost consciousness." The plane had hit the starboard edge of the anti-aircraft platform, skidded across it, and then fell off the port side and into the sea. 15 men were killed and 29 were wounded, including Wallace, who was awarded a Navy Cross for his efforts in rescuing wounded men from his battle station despite his own injuries. The men on the anti-aircraft platforms all received posthumous Navy Crosses for maintaining fire on the plane until it crashed on their position. They were as follows: William F. Cates, Seaman 2nd Class; George R. Eisel, Seaman 2nd Class; George I. Falgoat, Seaman 2nd Class; Andrew J. Gandy, Seaman 2nd Class; Eugene F. George, Seaman 2nd Class; Albert T. Harris, Lieutenant Junior Grade; Harry J. Lowe, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class; Jackson K. Lloyd, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class; William T. Powell, Gunner's Mate 2nd Class; Frank O. Slater, Seaman 2nd Class; and John L. Williamson, Seaman 1st Class. Each of these men had a destroyer escort named in their honor. Neil A. Carlson, Aviation Mate 3rd Class; Harold J. Chattel, Seaman 1st Class; Charles F. Greer, Fire Controlman 3rd Class; and Raymond N. Stolt, Seaman 2nd Class, were also killed in the battle, but did not have a destroyer escort named in their memory. A burial at sea was performed for all these men, and Frank Slater also has a headstone at Arlington National Cemetery. It is located in section MH, and his grave number is 694. His Navy Cross citation reads, quote, "For extraordinary heroism as a gunner aboard the USS San Francisco during action against enemy Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands area on November 12th and 13th, 1942. Courageously refusing to abandon his gun in the face of an onrushing Japanese torpedo plane, Slater, with cool determination and utter disregard for his own personal safety, kept blazing away until the hostile craft plunged out of the sky in a flaming dive and crashed on his station. His grim perseverance and relentlessness, devotion to duty in the face of certain death, were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave up his life in defense of his country." End quote. The San Francisco's crew began repairing the damage caused by the crash immediately after the air attack, but those efforts were abandoned that night once fellow cruisers and destroyers steamed into the barroom brawl that was the night battle of Guadalcanal. The American force, consisting of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers, attacked a Japanese force of 2 battleships and 13 cruisers and destroyers at a range of less than 3 miles. The wild melee lasted only minutes, but resulted in the loss of 13 of the 28 ships engaged. The San Francisco was struck more than 40 times by heavy shells and suffered 85 killed and 105 wounded. But she survived the battle relatively intact. She returned to Pearl Harbor and spent the next 4 months being repaired. She resumed operations in March of 1943 and served with distinction throughout the remainder of the war. She participated in nearly every major action of the war in 1944 and 1945 and had earned the Presidential Unit Citation and 17 battle stars when the war ended. Her crew had earned 4 Medals of Honor, 32 Navy Crosses, 21 Silver Stars, and 1 Bronze Star. The San Francisco also had the distinction of having no less than 15 ships named for her fallen crew members. None of these honors, however, could save the ship from the breakers. She was decommissioned in February 1946 and scrapped in 1959. While the San Francisco fought on, keels were laid for the destroyer escorts named for her anti-aircraft gunners. These 11 young men came from all over the United States. The only thing they had in common was that they were young. Albert Harris, the lieutenant in charge of the 20mm guns, was the oldest, at 27. Eugene George, the youngest, had turned 18 in April of 1942. Like the men, the ships named for them represented the full range of destroyer escort development during World War II. The ships included 5 of the 6 classes of DEs built, with only the Rudero class left out. The Loy was converted to an APD, and the Low and Felgut were converted to DERs. Although none of these ships saw as much action as the ship their namesake died on, each served with distinction during World War II. Jackson Loy of Effingham, Illinois, was the first of the 11 to have his ship commissioned. The Buckley-class USS Loy, DE-160, was commissioned on the 12th of September 1943. Between November of 43 and April of 44, the Loy escorted 2 convoys to North Africa and 1 along the eastern U.S. In April, she was assigned to the hunter-killer group built around USS Core CVE-13. She spent the next 6 months conducting anti-submarine patrols in the Atlantic before being ordered to Boston in October for conversion to a high-speed transport. With the conversion completed, the newly designated USS Loy APD-56 transferred to the Pacific, where she landed Underwater Demolition Team 4 at Okinawa. The Loy saw considerable action off Okinawa and came under numerous air attacks. She shot down 7 kamikazes, one of which landed so close that fragments of the plane damaged the ship and wounded 18 crewmen. Nevertheless, the Loy survived the war intact and returned home in 1946, where she was decommissioned and eventually scrapped in 1966. The second San Francisco gunner to have his ship commissioned was George Eisel of Gillette, Wyoming. USS Eisel DE-34, an Everett's class, was placed into service on 18 of October 1943. She was originally earmarked for transfer to Great Britain, but the expanding needs of the U.S. Navy caused the Eisel to remain in American service. She spent her entire career in the Pacific escorting convoys of merchant ships, first between the Marshalls and Gilbert Islands, then Guam and the Marianas, then the Carolines and Palos, and then the Philippines. The Eisel then followed the advancing wave of U.S. forces to Okinawa, where she screened escort carriers until June of 1945, when she was ordered home. She was decommissioned in November 1945 and scrapped 2 months later. November 1943 saw 3 of the 11 DEs commissioned. The first, USS Felgut, DE-324, named for George Felgate of Raceland, Louisiana, was commissioned on the 15th of November, 1943. A week later, on the 22nd of November, USS Lowe, DE 325, named for Harry Lowe of Paducah, Kentucky, was commissioned. These two ships served together in Escort Division 46. They operated exclusively in the Atlantic theater, especially in the Mediterranean Sea. Throughout 1944, the Felgate and Lowe escorted convoys to ports in the Mediterranean. In April, on their second convoy run, the Felgate, Lowe, and 10 other DEs fought off a large German air attack off the coast of North Africa. An ammunition ship and destroyer were lost, but the DE shot down several of the attackers. Once the remainder of the convoy reached port, the DEs started the return trip. The Felgate was near the USS Menzies DE 320 when she was torpedoed days later. And she was also with USS Fetchler DE 157 when she was torpedoed and sunk on the 5th of May. Despite the losses, the Felgate and the remaining DEs brought the convoy back to the US without any merchant losses. The Felgate spent the remainder of the war on escort duty, while USS Lowe was assigned to a hunter-killer group operating out of Newfoundland. On the 18th of March 1945, while on an anti-submarine sweep, the Lowe attacked a sound contact with hedgehogs, resulting in a large oil slick. Post-war investigation confirmed that the Lowe had destroyed U-866. Both she and Felgate were converted to radar picket ships after World War II, when the Felgate served in this capacity until 1962, and the Lowe is one of the last DEs to see active duty, remaining on picket duty and other assignments until 1968. USS George, DE 697, named for Eugene George of Grand Rapids, Michigan, was the third DE to be commissioned in November of 1943. On the 20th, the George served exclusively in the Pacific, where one of her first actions was one of the most memorable events involving DEs in the war. The George served as part of a hunter-killer group with USS England, DE 635, and USS Raby, DE 698, which sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. The George went on to escort convoys and conduct anti-submarine patrols in the Solomons, New Hebrides, Marshalls, and the Philippines. She performed similar duty during the invasion of Iwo Jima, where, on the 18th of April 1945, she rescued the crew of a B-29 bomber that had ditched near the island. She then escorted 2 convoys to Okinawa, and after the Japanese surrender, she delivered news of the end of the war and terms for surrendering to the bypassed Japanese garrisons at Truk in the Caroline Islands. Like the DEs before her, George remained in active duty long after the end of World War II. She remained in the Pacific as an escort, patrol, and training vessel until October of 1958. USS Cates, DE 763, named for William Cates of Drummond's, Tennessee. USS Gandy, DE 764, named for Andrew Gandy of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And USS Slater, DE 766, named for Frank Slater of Fife, Alabama, were all Cannon-class DEs built at Tampa Shipbuilding in Tampa, Florida. The 3 ships were assigned to Escort Division 35, which served in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Of the 3 ships, the Gandy was the only one to come into close combat with a submarine, when on the 16th of April 1944, she assisted the USS Joyce, DE 317, and USS Peterson, DE 152, in the attack on U-550. Gandy rammed the sub and hit her with shells before it sank. After that excitement, the remainder of the war was more mundane for the Cates, Gandy, and Slater. They escorted several convoys to Europe before VE Day, and then transferred to the Pacific, where they escorted more convoys and served on occupation duty in Japan. After the war, all 3 ships were transferred to foreign navies under the Truman Doctrine, the Cates to France as the Sudanese, the Gandy to Italy as the Altair, and the Slater to Greece as Aitos. On the 28th of March 1944, USS William T. Powell, DE 213, was commissioned in honor of Gunner's Mate Powell of Cincinnati, Ohio. His ship, a Buckley class, served as the flagship of Escort Division 66. While on one of our first convoy runs to North Africa, in August of 1944, the Powell and her division mates helped to fend off a night attack by German planes. The convoy and escorts reached port unscathed, but due to the darkness and the DE's smoke screens, it was impossible to tell if any of the attackers had been shot down. The Powell spent the rest of 1944 alternating between assignments to convoys and a hunter-killer group. The end of the war in Europe found the Powell based out of Londonderry, where she had then the pleasant duty of accepting the surrender of German subs, and then escorting them to ports in the British Isles. Like many DEs, the Powell was then ordered to the Pacific, but then she went into a shipyard first for an overhaul. She was still in the yard when Japan surrendered. The Powell then underwent conversion to a radar picket ship and was reclassified as DER-213. She spent most of the 1950s sailing along the eastern United States and the Caribbean as a reserve training vessel before being decommissioned in January of 1958. She was broken up for scrap in 1966. The USS John L. Williamson, DE-370, named for John Williamson of Ashe, North Carolina, was the 10th of the DEs to be commissioned. After entering service on the 31st of October 1944, the Williamson completed her training and then headed to the Pacific to escort a convoy to Iwo Jima. She spent the next few months engaged in anti-submarine patrols and convoy escorts between Iwo Jima, Eniwetok, and the Marshall Islands. Beginning in April of 1945, the Williamson sailed to many of the Japanese garrisons in the Marshalls that had been bypassed. Through combinations of air attacks and shelling, many of the garrisons were compelled to surrender to the Williamson and her companions. The ship was then sent into the meat grinder of Okinawa, but she arrived at the closing stages of the battle and saw no action. When the war ended, the Williamson joined many other DEs in occupation duties in and around Japan before being ordered back to the United States in January of 1946. She was decommissioned in June and remained as part of the reserve fleet until finally being sold for scrap in 1973. The last of the San Francisco gunners to be honored was the officer in charge of the platform, Albert Harris of Madison, Georgia. His ship, the John C. Butler class USS Albert T. Harris, DE-447, was commissioned on the 29th of November 1944. After her shakedown cruise in the Caribbean, the Harris transferred to the Pacific Fleet, where she screened operations against Morotai, Mindanao, and Borneo. She then spent the majority of her time escorting convoys around the Philippines. After Japan's surrender, Harris became part of the Allied occupation forces, visiting such ports as Shanghai, Hong Kong, and the island of Formosa. She was decommissioned in 1946, but like many DEs, she was reactivated during the Korean War. The Harris served as a training ship on both coasts throughout the 1950s. Her last assignment began in 1957 when she was ordered to New York City to serve as a reserve training vessel, which she did for the next 11 years. Finally, worn out after more than 2 decades of service, USS Albert T. Harris was decommissioned in 1968 and sunk as a target the following year. These 11 destroyer escorts performed admirably during their service careers. Some of them saw more action than others, and none of them came close to the San Francisco's combat record, but all of them performed their assigned roles skillfully. Most importantly, the ships all lived up to the high standards set by the 11 young men who sacrificed themselves for the good of their shipmates on the 12th of November 1942 aboard the San Francisco. Certainly, the same can be said for all other DEs and their crews.